That brings us to the public comment period. There's only one individual who is going to speak and address the board. I will establish the timer here. Mrs. Sandra Walden, the chair recognizes you for 3 minutes. When you start speaking, I will start the timer.
Okay. After the February 19th village board meeting, when the auditor gave the audit report, shortly after that, it was the 2018 audit was put on the village website, and I went through it and read through it. And on February the 25th, I sent you all an email, and I know that that Brian Long and Jay Tim and Kevin Schultz and Kim Rockford opened it because I got your return receipt. But I did not get a return receipt from Mayor Clatfelter or Mrs. Gray or Mr. Hahn. Back in the February newsletter, there was an article about the Speakers Bureau and how you're available to answer questions and that you are ready to answer questions. Well, in my email on the 25th, I asked about the audit on page 30, which said that the village had missed a bond payment of $325,196, and I never received a reply from anyone as to why that bond payment was missed. And in the March newsletter I read online, you talked about how the village is financially, I forget what the term you used, but that you're financially good, but yet we have a $5.6 million bonded debt from bonds and loans that we've got. So even I know that you're this year you're supposed to pay like $995,000 towards that $5.6 million, but at that rate, it's going to take you at least 6 years to pay off that debt, providing you don't expend any or commit to any other bonded debt. So, I think as for a small town that that's a lot of debt to be carrying. So, in my opinion. So, anyway, I just wanted to make it known that I didn't receive any replies, even though it's said that you're ready to answer questions, but I don't get any answers to my questions. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. So just to let you know, and I do not have, you did not get a read receipt, right? So that means I didn't read your email.
Mm-hmm.
But just to let you know, the village didn't miss a bond payment.
Why does the audit say that?
Well,
You want me to address this, or do you want to?
I'll tell you.
Oh, go ahead.
We'll both address it. How about that?
No.
So if you understand tax increment financing, and specifically the Route 66 development, the Route 66 development bonds were sold, and at the time, Illini Bank was in existence before they were bought out by UCB. So the infrastructure that was put in, the bond buyer was Illini Bank, okay? They buy the bonds and take the chance on the area developing. So if there are property tax revenues that are sufficient for that area, they will be paid back. If they are insufficient, they do not get paid back on those bond payments. So, under auditing procedures and auditing rules, a municipal government has to carry that liability on its books, but it is not a general obligation and liability of the village, if and only if there are property tax revenues that are sufficient to pay the bond. That is the revenue stream for the bond. Then that full bond payment will be made. If there are not, then the bondholder is the loser in the investment. And so even though there is County Market, Walgreens, the strip center that has Fire Nail, Snap Fitness, One Stop Auto, Seeney's Farm Market, even though there's all these businesses in that location, there are still properties that are available for purchase and that can be property tax generating entities. If they become property tax generating entities, they will obviously be paying property taxes. Their property taxes will go toward the payoff of that bond. But again, if there is not enough properties in that area to generate enough property tax revenue sufficient to pay back that revenue stream for the bonds, then the bank is the, I didn't want to call them a loser, but they lose out in terms of their investment. So there is no general obligation of the village. The village does not carry, or the village has to carry that on its books. But it does, and it does count against our debt essentially, but it is not a general obligation debt. It's called pledged taxes. And so in the audit, when you see something like that, it's very important. I would like to tell this to everybody. And anybody who's out there watching, listening, or just wants to know. If you read an audit, it's very important that you go to the notes and look and see what the notes say. And I don't have, I can dig out my audit. It's actually below my feet right now, but you will see in there an explanation as to that. And Trustee Schultz, at the last meeting, I believe, started to touch on it.
Yeah.
And we could have went into it further, but maybe we assumed that people knew that and the way that the auditors presented it. But just so you know, it is not an obligation of the village. The village has not missed a bond payment in the nature and true and sense of what you may believe or think that to be. Trustee Schultz?
Yeah,
And we also have Treasurer Stunkel here that can further explain that as well.
I tried to get that language to be not included because the village is not obligated to pay those bonds back. The village's only obligation is to collect the increased incremental real estate taxes from that specific project. If that project generates additional incremental taxes, then the village does have an obligation to collect it and pay it to the bondholder per the agreement. If the taxes aren't sufficient, there's no obligation to the village. So while that debt shows up as debt, it's only if the project is successful. And it is misleading to say we missed a payment when in fact we're not obligated to pay it because there weren't sufficient increased incremental taxes.
And so let's put it like this. Let's say there's a very large project that went in there that had a very large property tax bill. Say a huge hospital or a high-rise or something. It's not going to happen. But let's say that that did happen. And while there's the payments that are there now, if this project area started generating a substantial amount of property tax revenues from new projects that came in there, and it generated enough to pay back that $325, the bank would actually get that. Does that make sense?
Well,
The bank would get it if it's there. If not, they're going, and at the end of the TIF, when the TIF expires, they potentially will see a loss of $325 or any years that are left on the TIF, which is a few more years, those years' losses as well. But they could potentially, depending on new projects that come to that area, see that portion be paid back and make the bond that they purchased and took a chance on cash flow and not have a loss.
so you're saying this, the bond series 2011 are those bonds? Because below that, there is another paragraph about the TIF notes payable in Route 66, and it says the total note payable balance to the developer as of April 30th is $454,916, which is a different amount than the Series 2011 bond. So
let me explain what that is. So it's a little
Hey,
different.
Treasurer, please come forward to the
Yeah.
podium since you're
So that number
official.
there, so, can I take that for a second?
Yeah.
Thank you. So these are kind of complicated bonds, and it's the best thing, the way to explain these bonds are that they're revenue bonds. They're not general obligation bonds. And what a revenue bond is a limited obligation bond. It's not backed by the full faith and credit of the village. We're only agreed to pay back revenues that were received, that we have already pledged
Do you,
to that
do you
bond.
understand the difference between general obligation and revenue bonds? Do you understand the difference?
Well, I thought I did, but.
So what
That's,
happens?
that's important. I mean, it's important before anybody, I'm not saying you, but before anybody makes any statements out loud or writes it online or puts it out there, it's important to understand it before misleading or incorrect information is posted.
Well, the way it's presented in the audit, it looks like that it's, been bonded out for this many years with this amount of payment each year for a total of this amount. So to me, that doesn't look like a revenue bond thing. That looks like your typical bonded debt.
So there is.
Schedule.
So the bond actually has a schedule of payments that are required to be made. They're required according to the bond, but we're not required to make any payments unless we actually get those revenues. And so what, that first part of the notice where it says there's $325,000 that went unpaid, it did. It went unpaid, and it's really just there to tell the readers that on this bond, these payments were not made, but they were not made because revenues were not received. We did make payments approximately $422,000 during fiscal year 2018 on these bonds.
Well, it would have been nice if the auditor had put that wording in there.
Well,
And this is typical wording for all
Yeah.
audits for
It
villages
is,
and cities, and
Go-
it's typical.
you're referring to, is on page 30,
Yeah,
go to page 29, it says the subsequent bonds, and there's a phrase in there about only paid from incremental tax revenue generated by the specific project within the specific TIF.
That's it.
It's sort of awkward reading, but that's where it says it's only additional revenue.
But actually, what's required of these bonds is if the village doesn't make the payment, the bond actually requires the developer to make the payment, I believe.
but the way
Well,
it
There is
says,
no,
Well,
to make up the difference is what I think is supposed to happen.
that's probably true. Think of these bonds as a loan. The bank made a loan to the developer for this project. The idea is the developer would put in roads, streets, people will come there, build buildings, the developer will make a bunch of money, the bank gets the loan back. The reason they came to the bank, or came to us years ago, is that if they go through this TIF process, they become tax exempt to the bank. So that way the developer gets a lower interest rate, the bank doesn't pay taxes on it, and it just makes it better and easier to be successful.
A certain component of it. So certain things, certain capital costs can qualify as tax exempt.
Yeah, there's specific rules about it, but it's a way for the developer to pay less interest to make the project more successful. The project, from a development perspective, while there's a county market and a Walgreens, which is very good, was not successful from a developer's perspective. It took way too long, the recession hit in 2008, it sat there, and when you put in roads, streets, and all that stuff, underground sewer, and you don't sell any lots, the interest monster eats you up. So that project from a development perspective was not successful.
well, it's just bad then the way that the audit put it in there that
And I-
the village is not in compliance.
I know, and
It's what they do.
yeah,
It's
I
not-
tried to get the
Really is
language
what
taken
lawyers
out,
do.
but he said, per the specific reading of this, you're not in compliance because it wasn't paid. However, and he's probably right, people that are actually making decisions about the village as far as investing here would know that. And they would, and that's why it has to be in there, is that a future developer has to know, well, that bond didn't work out. Well, it wasn't the village's fault. And they would know that. But they would know that particular project did not meet expectations.
So the village will enter into redevelopment agreements for the purpose of economic development and developing certain areas. the benefit to developers in developing an area is that under certain qualified expenses, they can become tax exempt. Similar to the project that we did with the Villa Healthcare, center over here. Well, that saved several $100,000 for that entity because of the tax exempt status that they acquired by us introducing and allowing them to use our name to sell or purchase industrial revenue bonds.
Right, those are different kinds, and they don't, and you don't carry that debt, they do. I mean, it's on their books, not on your books.
Well, I mean, we're getting into this is complicated, government financing.
And they're not really on our, they're not on our books since they're not an obligation.
Right,
Basically.
right, they're your obligation.
The paragraph that I think might clear us up a little bit is footnote 8, and it's under the section tax increment financing payable bonds. The tax increment financing bonds are a limited obligation of the tax increment financing district of the village, payable solely and only from collection of incremental taxes from each specific, and then it's highlighted, project increment area, are deemed to be pledged taxes irrevocable until the obligations are discharged. The next paragraph. These bonds do not constitute a general obligation of the village. However, the bonds payable are required to be reported on the village financial statements. So they're not an obligation. So our general fund, which has quite a bit of cash, there's no way United Community Bank can get to that. They're only entitled to the incremental increase of the real estate property taxes in that specific area. And you did make a payment in January for our taxes that we collected from that district in 2018, correct?
Correct.
Yes. So what we collected in 18, they got in January. Wasn't enough, but too bad, so sad. I mean, so it's very misleading. Try to get there, take it out. Wouldn't do it. So
So the last question we had about the no payable, the $454,000.
Right.
So what's happened with that is the developers, I believe, is required to make payments if we don't, and the developer did make some payments.
Right, and that was clear, but the thing above, about the 2011, was not clear.
So if we did collect enough incremental taxes to pay back the bonds, we would, and had additional taxes, we would have $454,000 that would go back to developers if we had enough to pay that back. But it looks like that. My projections, I think, are somewhere around, we might collect $1.5 million if what we're getting currently holds true, and so that I think they'd be out close to $800,000 on just principal only, not counting any interest going forward. So
Well, that TIF doesn't generate the kind of revenue that the original TIF does.
Correct. And so the second kind of part of your statement we should address as well. In terms of debt for the village of Sherman. Now, I don't know how familiar and knowledgeable people are regarding tax increment financing, but essentially the TIF districts are going to expire. If we do not do anything with the TIF revenues, at the expiration of that TIF, they would just be turned over. So the whole point in the TIF district is for economic development. And for a very large number of years, we've been seeking economic development. We've made incentive agreements with County Market to bring a grocery store here because we knew that the entire town, through a survey and face-to-face conversations and various different interactions, people wanted some things that were good quality of life and nice amenities to where it could add to our sales tax budget as well as keep people here local in Sherman. So we've incentivized County Market to come here through the use of tax increment financing dollars. We use TIF dollars to incentivize Walgreens for them to get to pull the trigger. I can tell you from the negotiations with the grocery store, multiple different chains, but essentially the gist of the conversation was way back when we ultimately, got that deal hammered out, was we love Sherman, we love the area, but geographically, the numbers aren't here. We're not gonna be here for another 10 years, no grocery store is. So they presented pro forma to us. We reviewed it. We had our professionals review it, legal counsel. They'd shown losses in the first 3 years of operation. And so we worked to offset some of those losses with the use of tax increment financing dollars. Not only did we do that, but we stipulated and mandated that we were taking into account this incentive that was being given to you was also to make the facade of your building more attractive as opposed to just a utilitarian building. Our interest in metal pole barn buildings or split face painted block wasn't there. We wanted to establish a new standard for the buildings and the look and feel, so there'd be a shopping area that you wanted to go to and not that you just had to go to. And so the dental molding that's at the top of County Market, the stucco, you know, the brick that's on the buildings, all of this stuff didn't just happen, because actually, even after we signed the redevelopment agreement, there was some pushback, and there was some trying to wiggle room of actually not doing what was mandated in the agreement. So we pointed out that you have to have a stucco stone brick mix. That's what part of the incentive took into account. We want this building to set the tone so that the other buildings that come in look nice and are attractive, and it's an area people want to go to. Those TIF dollars continue to come in, right? But with our TIF funds, we don't even use all of the TIF funds. The Rail Point TIF doesn't have the same activity as the original TIF and the Route 66 TIF. So the Route 66 TIF, as we just went through, doesn't have revenue sufficient to pay back the bond. The original TIF actually has been in place for a number of years. The useful life of the total life of a TIF is 35 years. The initial inception life of a TIF is 23 years. You can get it extended. It's very, very tough to do, of which we did. And that extension can be another 12 years. So the original TIF generates a fair amount of dollars because a lot of the, all of the redevelopment agreements, incentives that were pledged in previous years have expired, so there's revenues in there. But as I think you know, the village declares a 50% surplus in the TIF. And it started doing that in 2009, 2010, when we got the TIF district extended. And that takes an act of the General Assembly to do. And so we worked with each and every single taxing body, the school district, the county, the road and bridge, the township, the fire protection district, the library district. Every single taxing entity had to be reached out to and convinced that this is good for the entire area and good for all of us, including them. And so everybody signed on, they passed resolutions. We had a sponsor in the General Assembly. We got it passed through the House and the Senate and signed by the governor, so the TIF was extended another 12 years. So what we've done by declaring a 50% surplus in that TIF, we've said that we have the ability to use 50% of those revenues to continue economic development, because it's very important that we try and build our sales tax generating businesses for those sales tax to go into the general revenue fund. But also, we set back 50% of the revenues, and then it works out for the school district, because when we send the 50% of the revenues back to the county treasurer, then those are dispersed pro rata to every single taxing body. So the school district gets 66% of a tax bill. And when they get 66% of that surplus, and the way that a TIF is established, a district, that equalized assessed valuation doesn't count against them in the general state aid funding formula. So it actually worked out to the tune of a lot of money, additional money for the school district to utilize with the TIF not expiring.
Well, it was to be
So
until the General Assembly shorted the school district for a number of years. And so it didn't really work out as well as they thought, but whatever.
well, that's different, but the revenues from the village still continue to come from the village tax increment financing district to the school district. So when Mr. Route, God rest his soul, great, unbelievable guy, when he was there, he was so thankful of the fact that these TIF revenues were coming in because of what the state was doing. But going back to the debt and tax increment financing, if you don't understand it, that's an issue. But I want to make sure that everybody does. So use it or lose it. And if you don't use it, you're going to lose it. We didn't want to lose it. But here's the thing. We carry some debt on the books in the TIF. I would say it's artificial debt because we know the time frame of the TIF. And so what we did essentially is simply, a few years ago, advance some of the future revenues in order to do the amphitheater, and some of the other projects in there, the roundabout, the roads, some pavilions and stuff like that. We knew we're getting those revenues. What's the payback? 5 years on it? It's like a 5-year payback. We just advanced it for the project right now. When we did mapping for the future, back when I was still a trustee, there was a 50-member panel of citizens all over the village of Sherman that was comprised. I think, Vicki, you might even sat, I don't know if you sat on that, but I remember Becky Finley, Brett Hahn sat on it. Numerous people from all walks of life sat on this committee. And we broke into working groups and figured out what Sherman wanted. Some people said that, this was a priority. Some people said this was a priority. Some people said this was a priority. And then everybody came back together. And one of the things that came about was a stage or amphitheater type presence. There was also a second initiative from the Springfield-Sangamon County Regional Planning Commission, Director Norm Sims at the time, talking to the village about the need for an amphitheater or stage type presence on the northern end of Springfield to possibly include Sherman, because the Muni is all the way on the south end of Springfield. So let's get something out here on the north end of Springfield. Sherman said, we can do that. And so we worked with the Sapp family to come up with an awesome plan that included all kinds of different things, and it's migrated and changed over different periods of time. But we carry some debt right now that, like I said, I don't consider it true debt because it's going to be paid back every single year of those 5 years just from the property, from the TIF revenues that go into the treasury and go right back out. In order to get an amphitheater, in order to get the pavilions, in order to get something in this community that starts generating, a vibe. And so when we had the plans for the park drafted, Farm Credit Service is a true testament as to why Farm Credit Services is a testament. The park is a testament to why Farm Credit Services is there. Larry Ellinger, who lives out here now, he could tell you. We presented those plans to him. The Farm Credit Services was looking at multiple different locations to relocate its corporate headquarters. They were way out west. They had Lincoln. They looked at the northern part of Sherman. They looked at Dirksen with easy access off of that interstate and various different. When we presented those plans to Farm Credit Services, Mr. Ellinger, he loved it. My employees can go out there, and we showed them the walking path, this 10th, we got an easement agreement from the Sapp family, showed them this walking path that would be there, these pavilions that their employees could go picnic at, and all the different activities that will be taking place in this park, bringing the community together, and, just the vibrancy and the progressiveness of what Sherman could be. So they ultimately settled on that location. They didn't even choose our northern end. They chose next to that park. But this is why we use those TIF funds. Going back to that mapping for the future and the Springfield-Sangamon County Regional Planning Commission that updated our comprehensive plan. Our citizens in Sherman said they wanted that. They said they wanted a grocery store, they wanted a pharmacy. That's why we do that. That's why we bonded against, for 5 years, the future tax revenues that were going to come in. When the TIF expires, that expires. So it's not long-term debt that we're going to carry for a long period of time. It would be misleading to think that. Do we have to carry it on the books under auditing procedures? Absolutely. Should we? Absolutely. But if you understand and know the whole story, then it paints a much prettier and better picture. And so going back to the general revenue fund, as Trustee Schultz spoke of, I think when we took over, there was like, after all bills were paid back then, and we're not gonna say anything bad about previous boards or anything like that, because they've set us up for a lot of prosperity. Mayor Meredith and Mayor Zimmerman and all these other people, they set us on a path of prosperity and projection. What we've done is manage those TIF funds, because I didn't set up the TIFs, but they were there, and they've allowed us to have tools in our tool pouch to do so. But there was about 100, and it was a small municipality. We're a growing community. So you gotta manage this. Is our financial health stable? Absolutely. Is it off the charts? Absolutely. We're very financially stable, very financially healthy. But there was $110,000 cash on hand, I believe, or something like that, when we started back in 2007. Now, Treasurer Stumple, it's like a rainy day fund. We almost have enough revenues in the general revenue fund to operate without one revenue coming in. We're nearly, what, $1 million in there?
We're close to $1 million in our fund balance, correct?
Close to $1 million in our fund balance. That doesn't include all of the dollars that we spend all year long, paying salaries and, for salt and everything that the village does. That's in addition. That's why Mr. Painter of the Williamsville Sun-Times it's historical, it's online, you can look it up. Year after year, his headlines, Village of Sherman surplus. We underspend, we have surpluses. Our contingency fund grows. Sometimes it's contingency, sometimes it fluctuates. Things happen, things come up. But the fact of the matter is we went from $110,000 cash on hand in the general revenue fund to right at $1 million.
Well, but you have $1 million debt every year too, according to the, page 31. You have $995,000 you have to pay this year, so,
That's a lot of
I mean,
But
We
again,
did a bond.
That bond there, you're looking at the revenue bond. So that money only gets paid if you collect that amount of revenue for that TIF bond. So what's important to realize is that, I think in our financial statements, we had $16 million in assets in the village at the end of our last audit. That's a fairly healthy number. And I'm not sure what you quoted for debt, but it was, I think actually our debt was, I think, close to $6.4 million when you talk about all the bills that were outstanding at year end. But that's a healthy, it's a $10 million surplus. It's a huge number.
Especially for a small community. So, all I do is I caution anybody that speaks to the village's finances that doesn't know it, because it's very, very, very complicated. And what this village board and previous village boards have done is pretty astounding, especially when you stack it up against other municipalities and communities. And the results are visible. You can just look around town at what we've been able to do with tax increment financing. I think we are a testament to why TIF should exist. And what a board working together can do to make a community prosper and look nice. We just did a bond issuance, right, for infrastructure. We repaved about every single road in Flagland. Our general property tax levy made up less than 1% of a tax bill a couple years ago. Less than 1%. Let's just use round numbers. A $5,000 property tax bill, the village of Sherman would get less than $50 of that tax bill to pay our police officers, to pay our public works people. So we did a bond issuance for roads and infrastructure, because there's a lot of dips in roads and cracks. We have extreme winters, we have extreme summers in Illinois, expansion and contraction. Roads buckle, snowplows come along, they rip chunks of the road up. Sewer lines are installed, water lines are installed. The ground underneath them settles over time. The warranty on those roads doesn't last 20 years, doesn't last 15, doesn't last 10, doesn't last 5, it lasts a year. So the developer puts that in, and then it's turned over to the municipality. And so then it's on you to fix. And so we did a bond issuance a couple years ago, Now we make up about 2.5% of a tax bill. So, out of the grand scheme of things, on a tax bill, it's negligible. Before, it was less than $50 on a 5,000. That's like, you can't even go out to dinner for that practically. Now, it would be 100 or 150 bucks of a tax bill. But you're driving on smooth roads. Are there other areas in town that need fixed? Absolutely. Are there huge pressing issues that need fixed? Absolutely. But it's gonna take the financing wisdom of a village board to be able to do that and have healthy and sufficient balances in there, rainy day funds, things like that. So I just caution about talking about debt and, missing bond payments and things like that, because there's a full picture and a much, much, much greater in-depth picture to government financing and general accounting rules and how things are reported these days, even more so than in the past. Anything? Treasurer Stunkel, anything? So that all being said,